Everyone, my name is Beth Groves, and I am a professional development specialist here with IACAC, or the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. So today we're going to be covering working with special student populations. We'll go through some of the more common situations you might find with these kind of situations and student populations. And we just want to make you aware of the fact that we do have other on-demand webinars available on our website. So if you want to look at anything else that we have presented and recorded, that is available there just for you to kind of access at your own pace. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I will pass it over to my colleague Megan at the second half here. So just an agenda of what we are going to go over today. So we're going to first cover unaccompanied and homeless youth, what that means, especially on the FAFSA, and then we'll move into students in DCFS and foster care. And then I'll pass it over to my colleague Megan to cover undocumented students, as well as some resources for all of these special student populations. I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, the chat is open and my colleague Megan can keep an eye on anything that comes in and address that. And then during her portion, I can also keep an eye on that, just if anything comes up, but we also will provide you with our information at the end, just in case something comes up later. All right, so the first thing we're going to go through are going to be our unaccompanied and homeless youth. So we just want to go through a few statistics with you to give you an understanding that this is a common experience. So for our students who are experiencing homelessness, we're looking at about 1 out of 30 teens, which when you first hear that statistic is a pretty staggering statistic. To think that, maybe people that are in your high school, or even if you're thinking back to your own high school days and thinking that, okay, 1 out of 30 of my classmates was experiencing homelessness. That's a pretty staggering statistic to think about and really put faces to that number there as well. It's also important to understand that our LGBTQ plus students are much more likely to experience homelessness. They're more than twice as likely. So that's something else to be considering. Giving more supports to our LGBTQ students and just making sure that they have the supports they need and understanding that they might be experiencing homelessness at higher rates. So students who are experiencing homelessness are also more likely to have a distrust of adults as well as their support. They may not feel that people who are adults in their lives are actually going to give them that support. Maybe, especially if they have been kicked out of their house, they don't necessarily have a place to go. They're going to not necessarily believe that we're saying that we're going to offer that support, and they're also, going to be able to accept that. So just be aware that that is something where you might need to tread carefully. When we're looking at students who have couch surfed, we're looking at about 93% of students who are, experiencing homelessness. That means that they're moving from one person's couch to another. It's not a fixed living situation. It's not adequate, right? They're living on couches. They don't have a place of their own. They don't even have a space of their own within that house. They're just, sleeping on couches. So we're looking at 93% of students for that. 35% of these students have also experienced the loss of a parent. So looking at a lot of students who are not only experiencing homelessness, but are missing a parent's influence to lead to that distrust of adults as well, and that support. So there are a few ways that these students can be identified. So the first would be a teacher who is familiar with the situation. Maybe this is a teacher that the student is feeling close to, connected to. They feel like they can confide in that teacher. Same goes for counselors, right? So they might also feel like they can confide in that counselor and can talk about that situation. So those are 2 ways that they could be identified, but this could also be something where the student is going ahead and self-identifying that they are experiencing homelessness as well. This is not something that's always going to happen because not every student is going to view themselves as experiencing homelessness, but that is a possibility that they could just self-identify that way. So we want to look at this from a FAFSA perspective because they do have some very specific definitions when it comes to a student who is experiencing homelessness. So they are going to list out 2 different definitions. The first is going to be homeless, and the second is unaccompanied. The reason is because these two designations are required for a student to be considered an independent student for FAFSA purposes. So that means that they need to not only be experiencing homelessness, but also be an unaccompanied student. So that's why FAFSA gives these very specific situations and definitions, so that if you are assisting a student with filing a FAFSA, you can understand, exactly what these definitions are, so that you're adequately determining whether or not they potentially are homeless and unaccompanied youth. So when we're looking at homeless students, that's talking about lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. So I was mentioning before with that couch surfing, that's not fixed, regular, and adequate housing. So this is going to include lots of different things, because not every student experiencing homelessness is experiencing it in the same way. So if a student is living in a shelter, that could be an example here, but they could also, be living in parks, they could be living in a hotel, any kind of public space, they could be living in their car, or maybe they're living with, say, a friend, right? They're living with their friend in high school and their friend's parents. So that's kind of a temporary living situation, just because they don't have anywhere else to go. So the reason that living with someone else, even if it feels to them like they have adequate housing, is not technically going to, be that the student is not experiencing homelessness. The reason is because the student could, right, be kicked out at any time from that living situation. They don't have any obligation, those friends' parents or that friend, to legally keep the student there. So it is lacking that fixed, regular, and adequate housing. That could be a student who's experiencing homelessness. Students who are fleeing abusive parents, they could also be considered experiencing homelessness, because their parent would otherwise be providing that place to live, but they're trying to flee that abusive family environment. And then when we look at our unaccompanied definition here, this is talking about being not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So I mentioned before that a student needs to meet both of these prongs. They need to be experiencing homelessness, but they also need to be unaccompanied. So an example of what would not qualify here is a student who is living in a shelter, but maybe they're living in that shelter with mom. They are not unaccompanied in that instance. They have access and contact with mom. So that means that they can provide her financial and demographic information on the FAFSA, and they would not meet this criteria. It does require a student to be meeting both of these prongs to be considered independent for FAFSA purposes. All right, so this is what it looks like actually once you get into the FAFSA for those student homelessness questions. You'll see that we have gone through student demographics, school selection, and now we're going to look at dependency status. So remember, student has to meet both of those prongs to be considered an independent student for FAFSA purposes. So it will ask them if they were at risk of, or if they are homeless. They can answer yes or no. And the nice thing with FAFSA on the web is that it's going to use skip logic. So if the student answers no, they're not going to actually see this next question. If they answer yes, they will see this question, and we'll ask them about a determination. So we're going to go through what that looks like, each of these three options, but know that there are three options for the student to receive a determination, to say that they were an unaccompanied youth who is homeless, or they're self-supporting at risk of being homeless. So if the student doesn't have a determination, they can mark none of the above, and we'll talk more about what that's going to look like for students who still believe that they are at risk of being homeless, but don't have a determination. So once the student has marked either their determination from one of those sources that they have listed, so one of those three, and again, we'll go into more detail with those, they can go ahead and say that they're unaccompanied, and they'll be able to show that determination in the instance of something like verification. So there are a few instances where a student is potentially not going to have that determination, and it will give them this option here. And that I just want to draw your attention to that screenshot there. So they will either say that, okay, well, maybe I'll just provide information about my parents. I'm not meeting both of those prongs, like the instance where the student is maybe living in a shelter with a parent. So they can go ahead and provide information about their parents. Or if they are a student who doesn't have that determination, they can go ahead and mark that they are unaccompanied and either homeless or at risk of being homeless, and that they're not going to provide information about their parents. So they can go ahead and proceed that way. It is important to understand that they'll need to be communicating with the financial aid office to kind of explain and have them be familiar with the situation so that they are allowed to proceed without providing that parent information. So we're going to go through the 3 different options for a student to go ahead and receive that determination. So the first one, and this could be one that you are most familiar with, just working in high schools, if you are working in high schools, is going to be your homeless district liaison. So these are going to be people who are specifically trained with this knowledge, specifically trained with McKinney-Vento knowledge as well. So they're going to, and this is a nice tool to see kind of who is available within each district, within, at each regional office of education, and how to get in communication with these people. So I've used this resource before working with students. If the counselor wasn't sure who was their homeless district liaison, this is a great resource to go ahead and be able to find this information. So this is going to be where the student is able to meet with this person and have a conversation to get that letter of determination that is asked for on the FAFSA. So this is one of 3 ways. So with the homeless district liaison, they're going to have that training through the regional office of education. It's going to be very similar across the board. So even if a homeless district liaison is in one school and there's another one in another school, they're going to have very similar training and be able to identify circumstances and situations for students. What they'll have is an interview with the student so that they can understand the situation, they can understand the circumstances that are happening for that student. And it is important to kind of prep the student to understand that this is something that might be a little bit intrusive feeling, but that it's just meant to just gauge that situation and understand if the student does need that determination. They'll often meet with people who are close to the situation. So I mentioned before where students can, maybe a teacher is going to identify the student as being experiencing homelessness or at risk of that, or a counselor. These are people that are often brought into this interview process just to identify that this is indeed going on and I'm close to the situation and I understand what is happening with this student. So if a student has had a designation before senior year, they will have to go through a renewal process to get that determination each year as well. And with a designation for McKinney-Vento, it's important to understand that that is slightly different than the criteria for purposes of the FAFSA. So when a student reaches that question on the FAFSA, the designation for McKinney-Vento is not necessarily enough to meet the criteria to answer yes when they're working on that homelessness question. So when we are working with students who are experiencing homelessness, they have a second option here to receive that letter of determination. So the first one was that homeless district liaison. The second one is going to be the director of an emergency or transitional housing program. That's going to be funded by HUD or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as that. So this is what the website looks like if you are working with a student who is, saying, well, maybe I have a letter of determination from this, but I'm not sure where to find that information out, to get that address, get that phone number, to see kind of what is available to the student to receive that determination, or especially if they already have received that determination. And again, maybe they aren't remembering exactly where that came from. So the third option is going to be the director of a Runaway or Homeless Youth Basic Center or Transitional Living Program. So again, this is what the screenshot of that is going to look like. So we're looking at DHS, and these are going to be locations available for students to be involved in those youth basic centers or transitional living programs. And again, this is a third option for them to go ahead and receive that determination. So that they can find out what is closest to them, or maybe where they have already received a determination from. So when we're looking at students who are experiencing homelessness, it's also important to kind of put ourselves in their shoes a little bit and understand that not every student experiencing homelessness is going to consider themselves homeless. So students, especially if they have not self-identified as homeless, maybe they've been working with a teacher or a counselor who views them as experiencing homelessness, they still may not consider themselves homeless. And an example of this would be, the student who is living with a friend and their friend's parents, right? So maybe they don't view themselves that way. They say, well, I've got shelter. I've got a friend and my friend's family who really cares about me. So they may not identify themselves as experiencing homelessness, especially in those situations. So it's important to just tread lightly. So it's also important to understand that these students may also be confused about what kind of options are available to them for not only going to college, but also for accessing financial aid, especially if they're an unaccompanied homeless youth and they say, well, I don't have parent information to provide in the FAFSA. Maybe they've heard a little bit about FAFSA and they know that they have to provide parent information. They may not understand exactly how that's going to work, exactly what being an independent student means, and what kind of financial aid would be available to them, as well as resources available to them at college. They also might not want to be seen as a burden. So if their peers or counselors or teachers are offering that support, they may not seek out that support because they don't want to be seen as a burden. They don't want their struggles to have to be put on someone else. They also are often unaware of the support services that are available not only during high school, but also available at the college. And we'll talk a little bit more about what colleges are doing to be able to support these students. But again, they may not be seeking out these resources. They may not even know that they exist. They may also require additional support as they transition to whatever their post-secondary option is going to be, whether that's going to a four-year college, whether that's going to a two-year college, or whether that's going into maybe a trade or going into the workforce. They might just require that additional support to understand, again, what those options are and how it's going to be possible for them. All right, we're going to transition now into talking about students who are in DCFS and foster care, similarly what that looks like on the FAFSA, as well as the kind of resources and supports that are available to these students for post-secondary options. So we want to start again, similarly to how we did with the students experiencing homelessness, to understand some demographics, some statistics for students who are experiencing and who are in foster care. This is specifically in the state of Illinois. So we're looking at a little over 20,000 youth who are in foster care, specifically throughout Illinois. This comes from Illinois DCFS, this information. So we're looking at 1,600 students who are in Illinois who are over the age of 18, and almost 4,000 who are between the ages of 13 and 17. And there are a lot of struggles that youth who are in foster care are going to face. They have some additional barriers. This comes from Foster Progress. They did an impact report that had some really interesting outcomes to understand what kind of barriers students who are in foster care are going to face. So we're looking at students who are in foster care by the age of 26, 57% become incarcerated. That's another one of those staggering statistics that you hear it and you're like, wow, 57, that's more than half. So more than 1 out of 2 students who are in foster care by age 26 are going to become incarcerated. 31% experience homelessness. So if you think back to our students who are experiencing homelessness, then you add in also being in foster care and those additional struggles that these students are facing. And then, maybe if you're working with a student who is in that LGBTQ community who already is experiencing that likelihood of being homeless, you're looking at a higher percentage. And then we're looking at 50%, so 1 out of 2 students, again, by age 26 in foster care, who are going to experience unemployment. So these statistics are enough to tell us that these students need extra support. So these are some of the extra supports that are happening within high schools. So with our DCFS and foster care students, they have 2 different meetings and plans essentially that get put into place. So the first is the academic planning meeting. So this is going to involve a few people. It's going to involve the DCFS caseworker, and they're going to meet with the student, the caregiver, and then school personnel. So this is something that's going to happen every single year at the beginning of the year, to go ahead and develop what's called an annual high school academic plan, so that these students are understanding not only the classes that are needed for them to graduate high school, to get, have some post-secondary options, but to make sure that they're on track for that, as well as to encourage post-secondary planning. So it's something that happens every year. So we're talking about, students who are freshmen who are having these meetings to make sure that they are taking the right classes, working with a lot of people who are involved in the situation, who understand the situation, just to make sure that they are on track, that they are set to go for the rest of those school years. So then we have something called the senior year plan. So this is a little bit different than that annual high school academic plan. So they still will have that annual high school academic plan as well that senior year, but they have something additional where they will talk about high school graduation requirements. They'll talk about college applications, scholarship deadlines. And then this is also where they will meet to talk about the post-secondary service options that are available to DCFS students. We're going to go through those options as well, but just to make these students aware that these are possible options for them to go ahead and go to college if that's something that they want to do. So when we're looking at the FAFSA, there is also a foster care question on FAFSA. So students are going to be asked if at any time they are or were in the foster care system. If they're not sure, there is a handy dandy little question mark to give them more information about what that means, if they can answer yes or no. It's also going to give them information about how to find out, maybe if they were in foster care as a young child and they don't remember, they can find out through through research, through that question mark, through DCFS and their records, to find out if they were a foster youth as well. So they also will have this information that goes and gets sent to the college that they are sending their FAFSA to, so multiple colleges, so that the college kind of gets an understanding and gets information to know if they need to provide additional resources to the student, specifically for those foster care resources. It will also ask about whether the student and if their parents have completed some kind of education and what the highest level of education that they've completed is. This is just to get an understanding if they are a first-generation student, so that there is additional support, again, especially if they're in that foster care system. So these are those DCFS post-secondary programs that I was just talking about with that senior year plan that they have. So the first is going to be the DCFS scholarship. So this is going to waive tuition as well as those mandatory fees. It also provides a reimbursement of books. It gives them a monthly stipend, about $1,200, which is pretty nice. It gives them access to a medical card, and it is available for 5 consecutive years. Then we have the youth and college and vocational training option, which is very similar. It's a similar stipend with that $1,200 monthly stipend. This is going to count for housing, reimbursement of books. So it's not going to include that tuition waiver, but it does have that monthly stipend. And it's up to 5 consecutive years or until the age of 25. This is going to be whichever one of those comes first. We also have an education and training vouchers. These are up to $5,000 annually for specifically education expenses. Similarly, also up to 5 years, or this one is up to the age of 26, whichever one of those is going to come first. And then there are also some tuition and fee waivers. So these are going to be specifically for public universities and those community colleges that are in district for the student. And it's also for up to 5 consecutive years. So if you want more information on these DCFS programs, they are put out by DCFS. This is included in that senior year planning program. So that is where you can find more information on these programs specifically. So when we're working with students in foster care, very similarly to our other special student populations, they have some hesitations, right? So they might be hesitant to share where they're living. They may not have something that's necessarily something that they're proud of or that they want to share with their peers, especially. They might also lack that adult support. They may not trust adults as well, if they've had bad experiences in foster care homes especially, but they're lacking that adult support. So it's important to kind of tread lightly with this one as well. They will require that additional support transitioning to whatever their post-secondary option is. So we saw those different options for DCFS scholarships, tuition and fee waivers, programs. So those are going to support students in post-secondary journey, whatever that looks like. They will also have lower rates of high school completion and employment. You saw that our students who are experiencing homelessness, who are in foster care, they often have those higher rates of unemployment, especially our students in foster care, they have higher rates of incarceration. So it's just important to be providing those supports, providing those resources to get these students through high school and onto whatever their post-secondary path is, to avoid some of those, again, staggering statistics. They're also less likely to earn a college degree, very similarly to why they wouldn't be able to complete high school or get a job that is going to support them. They don't have those resources. They don't have that adult support. So they are less likely to earn a college degree. And we are going to show you some resources that are available to students who are in foster care, available to students experiencing homelessness, as well as our undocumented students, which Megan will cover in a little bit. So universities are also doing their part to go ahead and provide resources for homeless and foster youth. So support services that are available on campus. So the first one is that they often work with the local housing authority to offer these students some kind of housing at a lower rate so that they can be either closer to the university or they can be closer to where they have a job. To be able to, maybe if their job is in an area where they can't afford housing, they can work with that local housing authority to get that housing at a lower cost. It also creates scholar programs. So a lot of universities have these programs where it's a cohort model. So there's a college coach, and students are going to be part of this where they can get not only academic support, so maybe there's an area they're struggling more, they can get financial coaching as well as emotional support while they are in college. And because they're in a cohort, they're really with other students who are in similar situations who get it, right? Maybe before they were hesitant to share their experiences because they didn't want their peers to judge them. But this is a really good example of how students are going to be in a cohort and work with students who understand their situation. They also create points of contacts. So these are going to be essentially kind of advisors for students to be able to have as a resource. And if they have questions, they need guidance throughout college, they can connect with whoever their point of contact is. And the nice thing with this is that it's not just like one specific area. It has connections to multiple departments. So the student is really able to reach out so that they can help and start building that autonomy and make decisions for themselves and understand that they are capable and that they can go ahead and ask questions when they need to and connect with people that may not necessarily just be their point of contact. And then a final thing that universities are doing is that they are creating on-campus food pantries. A lot of universities have these specifically on campus. A lot of towns obviously have them within the town limits, but students who are on campus who may not be able to get to those off-campus food pantries, this is really, really beneficial for students who are food insecure. And obviously these are open to all students, whether they are on or off campus. So it's really a source for students to be able to, get a little bit of additional support if maybe they're struggling a little bit with food one month or 1 week, to just get that additional support. And we will share where you can find more information about the food pantries that are available within Illinois and as well as on campuses in our resources section, but that is also linked at the bottom of this slide. And again, we can share this out at the end of the presentation just so that you have a copy of all of this information, these links. I am going to pass it over to my colleague Megan to walk us through our undocumented students. I have seen a lot of great questions come in the chat, so keep those coming and I will do my best to answer those while Megan presents.
Let me finish typing out this answer for DCFS. I'm adding Kim Peck's email for you all for their contact. About About the scholarships. So thanks, Beth. So hi, everyone. My name is Megan Crum. I am also a professional development specialist. I'm here with ISAC. So maybe I look familiar to some of you. I know some of y'all look familiar to me. So as Beth mentioned, I'm going to talk about working with undocumented students and the resources that they have. So we can go on to the next slide, Beth. So just for a basic understanding of, so that we're all on the same field of what does it mean to have certain immigrant statuses, and you all may work with students that have a variety of statuses. I know Beth and I have worked with students who've had a variety of statuses as well when we were corps members. But some things to know just to get started is that what does it mean to be a naturalized citizen? This means that this individual was born outside of the US, they applied and did receive US citizenship. One caveat is that they cannot become a US president because they are a naturalized citizen. The next is a legal resident or someone who is considered a US permanent resident or a US conditional resident, or having some other visa permitting them here, residency here in the United States. Now, if an individual who becomes a legal permanent resident or conditional resident, they cannot vote and they cannot be selected for jury duty. And then lastly, for an individual who is undocumented, these are individuals who are citizens of another country, and they entered into the US either in potentially one of two ways. So they entered into the US without inspection, or they received a visa to have residency here in the States, and they overstayed their visa and they remained in the US after their visa expired. Now, go ahead to the next slide, Beth. Something to make note is that DACA is not an official immigrant status. But in this regard, there's a lot of stigma around individuals who are undocumented or have DACA. And these are just some really great statistics that come out of the President's Alliance, which is a national organization that oversees and tracks what states do across the country for their undocumented students and their individuals. So here in Illinois, roughly, while this is not the most accurate list, because many individuals who are undocumented, that's a very private matter to them. They have this feeling that they don't want to share that information. So while there's an estimate number of 400,000 undocumented individuals here in the state, there's over 100 million, there's over 1 million in just the K through 12 system across the country. Now, majority of undocumented individuals here in Illinois are between the ages of 25 and 44. Out of those individuals, there's a little over 33,000 individuals that are DACA recipients and have DACA currently. And then if that even within that 33,000, 51% are DACA eligible, right? And so that they can continue to still be eligible for DACA based on those renewal applications. Now, there's this myth with undocumented students and working with DACA students that they don't pay taxes or their families don't. And that's simply just not true. There's a huge economic impact for these individuals as they contribute to society, as many of us do as well. And so there was some research done out of the President's Alliance and the migration policy that said, yes, these individuals do pay taxes. They have the option to apply for an ITIN, or an individual tax identification, pay a number, and they have that's how they report their taxes. That's how they file taxes. And so now that is just at the federal level. There's $945 million. And here in the state alone in Illinois, there's over 700 million. So that is a huge economic impact, and one of those stigmas that those families and individuals face. Now, at the national level, what's going to happen is that according to some research, there's over 450,000 undocumented students in college students alone. So whether that be in community college or as well as the four-year public institution. So when we see that 82% of public institutions, that does include four-year and community colleges. And then we see that 18% are enrolled in private institutions. And then here in the state, we have roughly a little over 20,000 who are in college here in the state. Now, this number could have gone up, it could have gone down. This research is about 2 years old, but know that that's something that these students are very much aware, and they're here in our state, and they have access to different policies that we'll talk about. Go ahead, Beth. So what does it mean to have DACA? So DACA is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So this was an executive order under the Obama administration that was passed all the way back in June of 2012. And we hit a 10-year mark just this year. And so what does it mean to have DACA? Now, there is no applications being accepted for DACA except for renewal applications. But it meant that when individuals got to apply, that it was a 2-year stay from deportation, and it allowed them to receive a social security number or an SSN for work purposes only. This is not a pathway to citizenship, and it can be eliminated at any time. Now, things have moved through the courts. We'll talk about the DREAM Act and hear what we do at the state. But in addition, the Supreme Court recently had a ruling on DACA as well. But it's important to note that DACA students are not eligible for federal student aid. Okay, they're not eligible for what's considered Title IV aid, so they cannot receive a Pell Grant or federal student loans. It does not disqualify them, though, from here in the state to receive a MAP grant if they're eligible. Similar across the country, there are other states that have what are considered tuition equity laws that allow them, students who are undocumented, to receive in-state tuition and other aid. But in addition to that, if you have a student that is being asked to fill out a FAFSA, there is a myth that DACA students can't fill out a FAFSA, and that's not true. They absolutely can. But if they are being asked to fill out a FAFSA, what's going to happen is that they need to be answering the citizenship question correctly. And they need to be, when it says, are you a US citizen? They need to be selecting, no, I'm not a citizen, or an eligible non-citizen. Because if in this case, because FAFSA is considered a federal form, and the Department of Education finds out that they answered wrong, it's considered that they were lying. And therefore, it could affect their pathway to citizenship later. So it's super important that they do complete a FAFSA correctly if they are asked. Well, here in the state, we have the alternative application. So here in Illinois, we don't recommend that they complete a FAFSA because there's the alternative application. But you may have worked with some students that go out of state for school, or some colleges that will require DACA students to complete a FAFSA so that they can see that they're not eligible for federal aid before attempting to receive institutional aid. Go ahead, Beth. Now, at the federal level, there's the DREAM Act. This was introduced all the way back in 2001 in Congress. It's had several passings of trying to go through the House and the Senate. It's never been passed. But it's something that provides guidance in how the state's going to do their own work. And so on the next slide, you'll see what Illinois does. So we have the Illinois DREAM Act. Go ahead, Beth. And so this was signed all the way back in 2011. And so this allows individuals, and specifically students, to participate in 529 plans. And so those are those college savings plans that they can use towards their education expenses. Now, the student would need to have that ITIN, again, that individual taxpayer identification number, and they would get that from the IRS. And so just as a caveat for some of this, for your families as they complete FAFSA, right? For parents, if you do work with families that are mixed status families, that ITIN starts with 9. Okay, and so that's a really good indicator that if they do have an ITIN, that it starts with a 9. Now, the Illinois DREAM Act did two things. It created a Dream Fund Commission, where it is a scholarship that they accept donations and raise those contributions to award scholarships to students, but then also develops and runs a training program for individuals who want to learn more. And so now the DREAM Act itself does not provide any state aid to students. That is the RISE Act. Go ahead, Beth. So there is what is considered our tuition equity law here in the state, and this is Public Act 93-0007. And so what this does, it says that any individual is considered an Illinois resident for an in-state tuition purpose until they establish residency outside of the state if they meet all of the following criteria. So this is the foundation of where the RISE Act comes from, or what is known as what leads the purpose for the alternative application. But this was our first law that was passed back in 2003. That is our tuition equity law, meaning that the student must reside in Illinois with either a parent or guardian while attending high school. They had to have graduated from Illinois high school or earned a GED. And then they had to have attended an Illinois high school for at least 3 years. And then they have to provide that university with an affidavit stating that if an option to become a permanent resident becomes available to them, they have to take that opportunity. So that is our tuition equity law that is for in-state tuition purpose for our public institutions here, Illinois. So go ahead to the next slide, Beth. But is the foundation of the RISE Act, or the Retention of Illinois Students and Equity Act. Now, the RISE Act does a little things different, okay? Even though the tuition equity law, the Public Act, does allow students to receive in-state tuition, it does not do the exact same things as the RISE Act. So the RISE Act was passed back in 2019, and it provides a pathway for eligible undocumented students who are disqualified from federal student aid to apply for state programs, including the MAP grant and other state funded programs, including DCFS programs. So the piece of this is that if you have a student who's completing an undocumented student that wants to receive the Minority Teachers of Illinois grant or a special education teacher tuition waiver, one of those programs, they still have to meet that criteria as well. So they can't circumvent the criteria that's set in ISAC's administrative rules. So yes, if a student meets the criteria for the RISE Act, they also could meet the criteria for MTI or SETTW, but they have to meet that. If there's additional criteria to meet, they still have to meet them. So if there's a GPA requirement, SAT requirement, whatever it may be, they still have to do that as well. Go ahead, Beth. So as I mentioned, the RISE Act builds upon the tuition equity law of that Public Act 93. So for the RISE Act purposes, the student must have resided with their parent or guardian while attending a public or private high school in the state. They had to have graduated from a public or private high school or received the equivalent of the diploma. And then they had to have attended school in the state for at least 3 years as of the date of the graduation, and that they received that diploma. Now you potentially may ask us, does that 3 years have to be consecutive? And it does not. Okay, you can have a student that say attended 1 year of grade school at a middle school here in the state. They left the state and they came back at the beginning of their junior year, and they will graduate with you now as a senior. They meet that 3-year requirement. In addition, they have to still provide an affidavit that says that, again, if there's an opportunity for them to become a permanent resident, they must take that opportunity. Now, some questions that we will get sometimes is like, well, what happens if an opportunity doesn't present itself and I've signed this affidavit? It means that they didn't circumvent the law. If no opportunity ever presents itself that the student to become a permanent resident, it's okay. It doesn't mean that they somehow circumvented the law or they're unlawful about it. It just means that no opportunity became available. And then additionally, they have not established residence outside the state of Illinois. So for the RISE Act purposes, a student must meet all 5 of these criteria pieces, okay? They just can't meet 1 or say 4 of them and not 1. They have to meet all 5 of them in order to be eligible under the RISE Act. Go ahead, Beth. So that is how the alternative application came to be. So the alternative application for Illinois financial aid is the application that comes out of the RISE Act. The RISE Act is the law itself, but the alternative application was created because of the law, okay? And so what it does, it provides an alternative process for students to apply for the MAP grant here in the state. And so most students are still completing a FAFSA. The kind of caveat that Beth and I have here at ISAC, maybe you've heard of us say it before, is that if you can complete a FAFSA, you can complete an alternative application. The alternative application is patterned after the FAFSA. So it asks a lot of the same questions, about financial information, demographic information. So know that if you can complete a FAFSA, you can complete an alternative application. You can help families do it. It does open October 1st, the same day as FAFSA here in the state for alternative app. It is available on our website. As I mentioned, it is patterned after the FAFSA, and it does generate an EFC for students. Now that it's not shown to the student, but it is sent to the colleges. And so that is that way that the college can estimate how much the student is eligible for MAP. Next slide, Beth. Now, for parental information, if you work with mixed status families, or if the family that you worked with, the student is undocumented as well as the parents, what's going to happen is that the key piece is that immigration status does not matter for federal student aid purposes of a parent. Okay, it is on the student. It's always on the student. It's never on the parent. So one thing to think of, whether a student is completing a FAFSA or alternative application, it's based on the student criteria, not a parent's. And so it's sometimes when I was a core member, and even now I still remind parents that it's not based on their information. It's based on their students, for eligibility. Now, if you work with parents who are mixed status, so the family is mixed status, what it means is that they potentially don't have a social security number, and that's all right. They would simply need to enter zeros, all zeros, onto either a FAFSA or the alternative application. Now, FAFSA will say, hey, we just want to make sure you check for errors. We want to make sure you meant to put all zeros, right? And it'll move through eventually. Similar to the alternative application, it will say, okay, great, just make sure everything looks good. But it's important that families are not reporting an ITIN. Okay, ITINs are only for tax purposes. They are not for FAFSA or the alternative application. Go ahead, Beth, next slide. So how would an individual sign a FAFSA in regards to if they are mixed status or if a parent is undocumented? So what's going to happen is that an FSA-ID tip is generally required to sign a FAFSA. So a student needs one and a parent. Now, for a parent who may not be able to sign a FAFSA electronically, they do have the option to print a signature page. And so this is what the screen would look like on a FAFSA. And it would show this box at the bottom right of your screen there. It says other options to sign and submit. And they would click that and it will open up an option to say, okay, yes, I want to either enter my FSA ID, submit without signatures, or I want to print a signature page. And so they would need to print that, print out that signature page. Only one parent needs to sign it. I will mention the Department of Education has rejected signature pages, and maybe you all have experienced that yourselves. Use black ink and only black ink. That the tips that I have for y'all is use black ink and only black ink. Okay. Making sure that the parents also sign within the line. So like I have a G in my name and some of y'all may, have J's and P's or whatever it may be, that you go when you sign your signature, that it goes below that line. Sign it like on the line, at the line and above the line, right? So if, I'm signing my name should not go below that line, that G, right? So, and make sure it's legible as well. Students won't be notified that their signature page is rejected. I had a student once when I worked with West Aurora High School that he kept submitting it. And he's like, I don't understand. He's like, I've called them and they're like, no, we can't accept this. So he took it to NIU actually. So some colleges will accept signature pages because colleges have the ability to edit a student's FAFSA on their end. So it's not all schools. You'd have to check with the school. But if you are encountering this piece that a student, their FAFSA is not being processed and they're like, your signature page got rejected. It's like, well, and you're not accepting it. I don't know what else to do. You could ask an institution that the student is going to attend to say, can you accept this, so that they can say, yes, we are, that way their FAFSA can be processed. Go ahead, Beth, next slide. So this is just a nice table that we've put together that just kind of explains who's eligible for what. So know that a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, and an eligible non-citizen are all eligible for federal aid, as well as state aid and institutional aid. Individuals who have DACA are not eligible for federal aid, but they can be eligible for state aid if they meet that criteria under the RISE Act. And then it does vary by institution. And then non-eligible non-citizens are not eligible for federal aid. They can be eligible for state aid again, depending if they meet the criteria. And then they could be eligible for institutional aid as well. Next slide, Beth. So this is a slide that comes out of the President's Alliance, but also is it attached with the National Immigration Law Center. And so it provides just these access to professional licenses and where it happens across the country. So here in Illinois, I know that the key is really small, but our state law states that if the only thing barring a individual from receiving a license is their status, is their immigration status, then they can move forward in receiving a professional license, if that is the only thing. So here in Illinois, we are one of those states, including California is one of those states as well. But you'll see in the map that, say in Arkansas, right, only nurses are eligible for this, but they have to be DACA recipients for those in those licensures. So they can't be undocumented. They have to be DACA, have that designation. Okay, next slide, Beth. So this does also come out of the the National Immigration Law Center, but it also comes out of the President's Alliance, that national organization I talked about. So this is a map of the entire United States that says where states have tuition equity laws. And they do a lot of this work about looking at what not just tuition equity laws, but also professional licensures for undocumented students. So here in Illinois, we are green, and to them, that means that we are a comprehensive state, that we provide a lot of, access to individuals here in the state who are undocumented to receive tuition and equity laws. You'll notice the western half of the country are all green, and that they do what this organization is considered comprehensive access. Now you'll notice some of those other colors, again, the key is really small, but one color is limited to DACA, right? So a student would have to have a designation of DACA in order to receive, say, their tuition equity or their financial aid in the state. This does get updated as states pass laws, right? So know that this absolutely can change. But I think it's those states in the surrounding areas that have restrictions. So especially down, in the Southeast there, down in Alabama and Georgia, right? If you do have, students that choose to go out of state, that they are aware of what they're eligible for. If they need to be applying as an international student, because some states do require that for undocumented students, that they apply as international students rather than receiving in-state tuition. Next slide, Beth. So similar to how we saw for homeless students and for students experiencing her in foster care, there are other impacts of being undocumented that that many people may or not aware about. And so some students are unaware of their status, and they don't learn about their status until they have to go, say, apply for a driver's license, or it comes time to do a FAFSA. And they don't know that their status is undocumented. And they have to talk with their families and what their next steps are, right? There is an immense amount of stress for some individuals because of the amount of college applications that they need to complete, if they can, where they're completing them to, and additional things that they need to submit to the college, but as well as that financial aid piece of, can they receive in-state tuition? Are they eligible for an alternative application? This fear of deportation, whether it's their own or their families, because maybe that family is a mixed status family, and that the student who, say, is documented, but their family is not, and that student is providing for their family, partially to help support them. The uncertainty over obtaining employment. Some students as students move through their college careers, and they, receive this degree that they love, but they can't obtain employment because the employer doesn't allow individuals without a social security number to have employment. And so this fear is, this uncertainty of like, well, what are my next steps? I did all this work, all this great work, and I paid this money, and I can't even enroll in the field that I want to, right? And then lastly, the overwhelming amount of anxiety and depression, and this fear just associated with being undocumented, and that this overall social stigma that these students don't partake in society, that they are less than, they are othered because of their status, but they have a right to be here, and that's a federal law that says that students are entitled to receive an education, especially in the K-12 system. And so, but understanding that these students oftentimes don't want to share that information with you. The one thing I always said to students is, if they did tell me and I didn't know, I always thank them, because they don't have to do that. They don't have to tell me that information. It's not something I need to know always to do my job. But if you don't think you have an undocumented student in your school, yes, in the Chicagoland area, there are more, and maybe down south there's less, but know that you may have them. And you probably do, you just don't know it. So understanding that these things happen a lot of impact their schoolwork, but also outside of school as well. And and getting jobs and whatnot. But even if you don't know a student who's undocumented, there's potentially one. Next slide, Beth. So how are universities helping students who are undocumented? So there is counselors, specialized counselors at colleges that specialize in training for working with undocumented students, and what does it mean to be undocumented. There are resource centers on campus. So this actually comes out of the University of California system. I think the biggest one that has it right now is Berkeley, that Berkeley started it. But what it did is it created a undocumented resource center, a resource center on a college campus, as this is specific to these students, just like any other resource, resource center on campus. And know that some campuses, if there's not a specific undocumented resource, it may be, housed with another resource center on campus, but understanding that some colleges don't have an exact resource center, but the UC California system, as well as the community college systems in California, have started this process. And then some states do have access to tuition-free programs for undocumented students that they can receive tuition-free because of their state laws that they have, and it's primarily to community colleges for this. Next slide, Beth. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to briefly touch upon some resources. So just for the sake of time, so we have our ISAC student portal. So one thing that we really learned in the pandemic was this piece of what are resources beyond financial aid. And while financial aid is a barrier for many students, it's not the only one. And so on our ISAC student portal, so you can navigate to the student resources beyond financial aid, but as well as food pantries. So as Beth mentioned, we have an entire list of all of the food pantries here in the state that are offered by colleges, or say like the Northern Food Bank that's out of, that runs out of DeKalb. We have a list of those. So if your students are food insecure or need some additional supports that you can't provide at your high school, but it's outside of school that you can share that with them, but you also can see it and see what the resources are in your area. Next slide, Beth. So as I mentioned, one of that resources is the resources beyond financial aid. And one of those is for SNAP benefits. So students who are enrolled in Perkins approved CTE programs at the college, so that specific funding out of the Higher Education Act, they can receive SNAP benefits. And so understanding that they can receive, whether it be a link card, if on WIC, but know that they also receive SNAP benefits. There are housing utility information for these students in that document that you can access, child and dependent care, and then what does it mean to request special circumstance and professional judgment. Next slide, Beth. So you're going to have access to the presentation. You'll have a PDF. So I'm going to skip these links, but know that all of these links are active, and it's where a lot of this research that we have for our presentation comes from. The one I will highlight here is Schoolhouse Connection. This is a national organization that provides trainings and different information for homeless district liaisons to understand how to help students through their post-secondary pathways, but also before post-secondary pathways as well, and what they can be doing for their students. Next slide, Beth. We have 2 pages of resources just for undocumented students alone. And so the one I will point out here is actually Foster Progress. It's a nonprofit organization in Chicago that works with foster care students. And what they do is really, they provide information and scholarships and help them transition through college and from high school into college as well. Next slide, Beth. Again, the big one definitely here I'll point out is the IACAC College Guide for Undocumented Students. So this is one that IACAC has created with their schools and looked at, okay, who can they contact? Is there a resource center on campus? And the work that, that campus does as well. Next slide, Beth. And then the current state of DACA, I will point out this one because a recent Supreme Court decision also change the decision on DACA and moving forward for those renewal applications and submitting new applications for DACA. So while the law is ever changing sometimes, but know that it's something to keep up on as well, that where it currently stands. Next slide, Beth. So just a plug for ISAC Core. So they are available for you to use, but also that if you have an alumni that you still talk to that reaches out to you for questions or anything like that, and you think that they would be a great core member because you've had a great core member or someone that you would know, please send them our way. We are happy to invite them and join our cohorts and what we have. And so that's just one plug for them. Next slide, Beth. the stuff that you've probably all been waiting for, your CE and PD hours. So you do have the option of earning continuing education credits and professional development hours here from ISAC. And so we need you to do is complete an evaluation. So all of the evaluations together. So Beth has put that in the chat for you all to access. And we'll follow up with you with the completed forms to report your hours. But yes, you can request CEs and PD hours for today's session. Next slide, Beth. So thank you so much. Right on time here. You are absolutely more than welcome to email Beth and I at the isac.outreachtraining@illinois.gov email. That's the team that we're on oversees that entire inbox. So you certainly can email us if you have any questions. You can sign up for e-messaging if you haven't done so already, especially because yesterday they announced that Gap Access was finally live. So since all of you are counselors and wondering about your FAFSA completion data, I imagine, potentially, really cursing ISAC's name a little bit there. Yes, is that Gap Access is now available to check out your senior class data. So that was announced yesterday through e-messaging. So if you have not signed up, definitely check that out and get signed up to receive those updates. So any questions? I know we're right at time here, but any questions from anyone or anything else?